Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome everybody from wherever in the world you are. I'm happy to be here with these special friends, and I'm very happy to introduce this panel focused on poetry for children and young adults. I'm happy to announce that poetry will be the focus of the special category of the Bologna Ragazzi 2021. So this is the reason why we have organized this panel in the framework of the events included in the program of the Frankfurt Book Fair. That is the place where we usually present all our news for the next year edition. So I wish to welcome our guests. Denis Besnosov will introduce them all, but I'd like to introduce and thank Gabriella Verdi that will be the translator of Maria José Ferrada. And Denis Besnosov has been a long time friend of the Bologna children. He is a poet for adults himself. He is a curator of the cultural activities of the Children's State Library, the Russian Children's State Library based in Moscow, and he is also curator of the children's program at the Moscow Book Fair, at the Nonfiction Moscow Book Fair, and also at the Red Square Festival. That is a wonderful festival that is held at the Red Square every year in May or June, if I'm not wrong. So please, for publishers, authors, illustrators, don't forget that the new special category of the Bologna Ragazzi Award is poetry. So work hard, get ready. We will publish at our website all the rules to participate in the next weeks, and we look forward to receive thousands of wonderful books and to award the best ones as ever. So I give the floor to Denis. Thank you very much for all the participants, and enjoy the panel.
Okay. Hello all. My name is Denis, and I'll be coordinating this roundtable talk, and we'll talk about the poetry. And it's my favorite focus because I write poetry, and it is really interesting to talk about poetry. The theme of our roundtable talk is a contemporary child's garden of verses. So it's a very beautiful title, I would say. And we're here, the authors and publishers of poetry, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. First of all, it is Maria José Ferrada, author of the poetry. She is in Chile, and well, what time it is in Chile now?
¿Qué hora?
¿Qué hora es?
La 1 de la tarde.
1 o'clock in the afternoon.
It's great. Bienvenidos. And the second speaker is Ariana Squiloni, publisher from Spain. Hello, Ariana.
Hello. Hi. How are you?
And Beatriz Massini. It is editorial director at the publishing house Bompiani, author and the translator of poetry. Hello.
Hello.
So first of all, I'd like to say that it is especially very interesting for me to be a coordinator of this roundtable talk, because Russian children's poetry has a huge history, and well, it's not a huge history, but well, 100 years, I would say, because everything happened in the 20th century, in the very beginning of the 20th century, and the first fairy tale that was written especially for children. It is the first fairy tale that we are counting the beginning of the children's literature, author children's literature in Russia. It was written in verses. It was called The Crocodile. It was written by famous Russian poet Kornei Chukovsky. It was written in 1918, just after the October Revolution, 2 October Revolutions. And it was about the crocodile who was walking around the St. Petersburg. And it was a bit a parody on the very adult poem by Alexander Blok. So it's very interesting that the root of the children's literature in Russia began with poetry. And well, Russia is a very poetic country, and well, many of you know the poetry of Alexander Pushkin, a classical poet of the 19th century. But talking about the Russian children's poetry, we have Kornei Chukovsky, we had a classic poet, Samuel Marshak, who wrote in a bit absurdist way with using different images of the common life of just ordinary people. We have this classical poet, Agnia Barto, who wrote for the smaller ones, and all those traditions, the just poetry about the everyday life, the poetry in an experimental, absurdist way, and poetry for the small ones written on the paradoxes, we can feel in the contemporary Russian poetry. Unfortunately, Russian contemporary children's poetry is not, well, is not published a lot in different languages, but it still exists in translation. And I would recommend some of the contemporary poets. For example, one of the most famous is Andrei Usachov, who's been nominated on the Hans Christian Andersen Awards 2 years ago. And another one is Grigory Oster, who was nominated just 2 years ago on the last season of the Andersen Awards. And there is one more person who is Anastasia Orlova, who I would recommend everybody, because she works in the tradition, in the classical traditions of poetry for the smaller ones. So I wanted to give this small introduction on the Russian children's poetry, because I'm coming from the culture of poetry, and we have a lot of really interesting authors who are translated, or who will be translated, I hope, in recent years or so on. So I have some questions which I sent to all the speakers, and I would like to ask them all about first. Nowadays, poetry, especially for adults, is not very popular. People write a lot of poetry, but there are not so many publishing houses specialized on poetry exactly. Not so many poetry books are being sold, etc. What about children's poetry? Is it popular in your countries? Does it succeed in the book market? Is it as popular or even more popular than children's poetry? Well, I'd like to start with Beatrice. What do you think about that question?
First of all, I like very much the title of this new section of the BolognaRagazzi Award as well, because it's a homage to Stevenson, to his Garden of Verse. So he was such a good poet. He managed to be entertaining, deep, funny. So that's what we look for when we look for poetry for kids. So that's great. And then also, we have to remind that the Nobel Prize has just been given to a poet, and that's a very, Mrs. Gluck, that's a very good thing, because it rises up our hopes for this kind of word to be, to find new readers all over the world. As for the, I think that there is, in Italy, it's not a matter of creating collections. I mean, there have been in the past some publishers for kids who had collections of poetry, and there still are. But I think the lead is more around the author. When there is an author who is a poet, so somehow people make place for him or for her in their publishing program, and that's very good because I mean, one author could write poetry and prose both. Sometimes it happens. So it's mostly about his or her personality as an author. Is it popular? I wouldn't say it is popular, but it's very well loved. It is beloved, especially in schools, for instance. I think there is a need of that because reading poetry together can allow very subtle and interesting exchanges. Also can be an invitation somehow to express oneself in other forms which are not so rigid as a prose is. Somehow you feel freer when you express yourself in poetry. So I think there is a place, a special place for poetry in the shelves, in our shelves, and but we also, as publishers, for instance, have to make that place. So it's mainly up to us to be able to find the right place in our programs, even though it's not so profitable. I mean, for instance, we just published last year, we launched a collection of poetry for adults at Bompiani, and the average sales are 1,000 copies, which is very good for poetry, I think.
Very good, very good. Yeah.
Of course, you have to balance so many things, but it's absolutely needed that we do that. So we have to do that. We have to find that place, I think.
And what about Ariana?
Yes.
How it happens in your country? Yeah.
I think that the situation is maybe similar to the Italian one. I think that maybe among publishers, children poetry is not that popular, whereas among children it is. Children tend to feel attraction towards the poetic word, since poetry has rhythm, plays with sounds, and creates magic. And the youngest children who do not know language yet know about sound and rhythm. But poetry, just like Beatrice was saying, tends to be seen as a difficult genre, at least when you talk about children 8 years old onward. We can say that in Spain, you can find a few collections of poetry board books for toddlers, published by the main publishing groups. But then it gets complicated to see a proper poetry corpus. Nonetheless, you do find some children's poetry books. And in Spain, in fact, there are a few children's poetry contests, the most famous of whom is the Orihuela contest, whose winner is published by Calandraca. And Maria Jose Ferrada won it a few years ago. Well, and then she will be able to talk about maybe all the prizes she has won, if she is not too shy. Whenever you get to talk with a teacher who reads poetry in the classroom and who fosters poetry workshops, because poetry, it's great for workshops with children, especially when you work on haikus and styles of poetry that have rules that create a basic scheme. Well, then children's reaction tends to be amazing, not only among younger children, but even among teenagers or young adults. So it all depends on the people who selected the books. And in this sense, if an author used to promoting his or her books in schools, then their poetry books tend to sell well.
Well, and what about authors? Do they read at schools, at the kindergartens, and so on? the authors themselves.
Bueno, como concuerdo con la opinión de los demás, que desde acá, un poco para contextualizar lo que llegar a lo que me preguntas, creo que en Latinoamérica hay un espacio que no crece, pero que se conserva y que se cuida y que se quiere para la poesía, tanto desde los lectores como desde los autores. Como bien decía Ariana, existen premios importantes, el Premio Hispanoamericano de Poesía para Niños, organizado por Fondo de Cultura Económica y por la Fundación para las Letras Mexicanas, el Premio de Poesía de Orihuela, organizado por Calandraca, al que cada año llegan cientos de manuscritos, 200, 300 manuscritos. Entonces, es un género que se escribe, los ganadores son publicados, se hace una selección, y creo que las editoriales grandes, si bien no tienen colecciones específicas de poesía, sí siempre dejan un espacio para la poesía dentro de su catálogo. Y sí diría que acá en Latinoamérica, donde más circulan los libros de poesía, en las editoriales independientes. Se me ocurre Calibroscopio en Argentina, Alboroto en México, Mágicas Naranjas, Editorial Maravilla en Argentina. Creo que los argentinos son los que más publican poesía para niños en este momento en Latinoamérica. Creo que si bien no es un género que sigue el ritmo acelerado de las novedades, siguiendo un poco las características del género, responde esa lentitud a las características del género. La poesía no se escribe ni se lee rápido, se mueve lento. También cuando circula entre sus lectores. Yo como escritora de poesía y también de otros géneros como novela o libro álbum, te podría decir que son, si bien se mueven más lento, viven más tiempo los libros de poesía, se traducen más, y una otra reseña sigue apareciendo mucho tiempo después de la aparición del libro. Entonces son libros que tienen una vida corta, o sea, una vida larga, pero lenta.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me start by saying that I agree with most of the comments made by my colleagues. I think that at least in Latin America, there is room for poetry that doesn't grow, but is preserved and cared for. The main publishers like Castillo, FCE, the Fondo de Cultura Económica in Mexico, Loqueleo, if they have no poetry collections, they certainly do have a space for poetry. There are 3 important awards, the Hispano-American Children's Poetry Awards by FCE and Fundación para las Letras Mexicanas, Children's Poetry Award Ciudad de Orihuela de Calandraca, and the Luna de Aire Award organized by the University of Castilla-La Mancha, which receive hundreds of manuscripts, at least 200 or 300. And the winners and a few shortlisted works are turned into books that then get published and circulated. There's more poetry among independent publishers like Calibroscopio in Argentina and Alboroto in Mexico, and a few smaller ones such as Mágicas Naranjas and the Editorial Maravilla in Argentina. I have to say that Argentina is the country that has the most publications of poetry. So although it's not a genre that can keep up with the accelerated pace of novelties, it is nevertheless a genre that we care about, research and love quite a lot. As an author of poetry who also works in other genres such as picture books and novels, I can say that poetry books respond to the characteristics of the genre. They move slowly because poetry cannot be written or read on the run, but they last, at least in my case, longer than other books. They are translated more, and the occasional books keeps appearing even long after its first publication. So poetry books' lives are long and slow.
Yeah, Okay, you mentioned Argentina. I've been to Argentina 2 years ago, and I was amazed by the amount of the bookstores in Buenos Aires. It's something amazing because you can see a bookstore in every corner. Everywhere there is a bookstore. We don't have so many bookstores in Moscow. Well, I have one more question for you all. How would you define the main tendencies of the contemporary children's poetry? Poets of the past have done a lot. They have used many original techniques, touched upon different themes, worked up different styles, from vivid realism to experimental forms and absurdism or nonsense. And what is the contemporary poetry for children? How the contemporary children's poet work now? Are there any common styles, or everyone is original in his or her own way? And I'd like to start with Maria Jose, because, well, as an author, I would like to start with her.
Es la segunda pregunta para ti, sí.
Hay un estudio que es una maravilla, en realidad, del investigador, escritor, poeta mexicano Adolfo Córdoba, que estudia con total detalle y con mucha profundidad la producción poética que se ha escrito en Iberoamérica desde 1980 hasta la fecha, y que profundiza también en la relación con las tradiciones, con las miradas anteriores, un libro que se llama Renovar el asombro, que es un trabajo que me parece muy importante mencionar y que el autor realiza a la par con una antología de poesía no rimada de autores iberoamericanos, que no había un trabajo anterior de esas características, que se llama Cajita de Fósforo, que será publicada en Ecaré en el 2021. ¿Por qué creo que es importante este trabajo? Porque creo que hay un interés desde Latinoamérica, un interés inconsciente tal vez. Con esto me refiero a que no se ha teorizado mucho al respecto, pero que se refleja en libros que se producen desde este espacio geográfico en los últimos años y no desde España, por trabajar este tipo de escritura libre que corre, sí, paralela a la producción también desde acá de rima. Hace algunos años había que defender los poemas, decir que a pesar de que no había rima, se trataba de poemas y no de cuentos. Creo que hoy por lo menos eso ya en Latinoamérica no es necesario hacerlo. El papel de la imagen, creo, en este contexto de la construcción poética también ha sido importante, ya que se utiliza como un elemento poético más, ampliando con la aparición que hace la visión de que el poema no es solo texto, sino que también es una forma de mirar, también puede ser un dibujo, también puede ser un paisaje. Por último, creo que ampliar esa visión de lo poético y de lo poetizable es fundamental cuando trabajamos con poesía y con niños. Un poema es un texto, pero también puede ser un canto, un dibujo, una experimentación desde la voz en la que los niños son más expertos que cualquier poeta. Esto no solo corre para los niños, somos muchos los adultos que disfrutamos de la poesía visual, la poesía sonora, la poesía fonética, que nos enseñaron también las vanguardias, ¿no?
There's a wonderful study by the Mexican researcher, writer, and poet called Adolfo Córdoba that actually explores in great detail and depth the poetic production written in Latin America since 1980 to date, and also delves into its relations with the previous views and traditions. And here I'd like to mention a book titled Renovar el Asombro, a book that I think is particularly important to mention, and that the author produces at the same time as an anthology of unrhymed children's poetry by Latin American writers. And it's the first example of this kind. That's why I really wanted to mention it. Why do I think this work is important? Because I believe that there's an interest from Latin America. It's an unconscious interest, perhaps, and by this I mean that little has been theorized about it, but it's reflected in the books coming from this geographical area in recent years, and not from Spain. There's an interest in working with this type of writing, which runs parallel to the rhyming work. A few years ago, we had to defend the poems, saying that although there was no rhyme, they were poems and not short stories. I think that today, at least in Latin America, there is no need to do that anymore. The role of imagery in the context of poetic construction has similarly been important, as it is used as an additional poetic element, expanding with its presence the vision that perceives a poem not only as a text, but also as a way of looking, for instance, at a drawing or a landscape. I think that expanding that vision of poetic creation and, as I can call it, poeticization is fundamental when it comes to children. A poem is a text, but it can also be a song, a drawing, or a vocal experimentation in which children are certainly more expert than the poets themselves. This is not only for children. There are many adults who enjoy visual poetry, sound poetry, phonetic poetry that were taught to us by the avant-gardes.
And Beatrice, how would you define the tendencies in Italian contemporary poetry for children? Your sound is off. Yeah.
I would say we can define them by negating what was in the past. I mean, the traditional poetry for kids passed mainly through school books, and it was full of descriptions or celebrating events, you know, Christmas, Easter, whatever, or describing just feelings, but mainly things or landscape, things like that, autumn, winter, so very, very traditional. And it was also pedagogic. I mean, the main themes were you have to be a nice kid, how to be a nice kid, things like that. Then Gianni Rodari came. I must say my favorite part of his work is the poetic one, because he had this so peculiar way of working with words, of mixing words and meanings, of joking with words, but with always a deep meaning in what funny and deep altogether. So that was the real change. I think nowadays poets tend to concentrate on the heart and feelings of kids. So they start from how a kid feels within his word, how he gets into relationships with people, with things, with the atmospheres, things like that. There is a very beautiful work on the form, of course, on the meter, but it comes together with the content. So that's when, I mean, I think it's the best thing when the form and the content go together and are really the same thing. And that happens in prose, of course, but that can happen, may happen more often in poetry. And I think that's exactly where the most important Italian poets are aimed. There are plenty, I mean, starting from Roberto Piumini, then Bruno Tognolini with his use of rhymes and jokes, and then Chiara Carminati, Silvia Vecchini. Some of them are also poets, I mean, in a wider sense. They are just poets. So they write for kids, they write for adults. It doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of that kind of small or longer form, or sometimes it's just the issues or the themes they choose. But it's, I mean, I think their intent is not different, and it shouldn't be. So that's that.
Okay. And Spain, Ariana, what do you think about Spain tendencies?
Well, Spanish tendencies in Spain. I think that in Spain we tend to play a lot. with rhymes, just like Maria Jose was saying, and with some avant-garde rules and things we find. Nonetheless, Maria Jose Ferrada is published in Spain by me, no, and by some other publishers, of course. And there's always a curious, a nice interconnection between Spain and Latin America. For instance, Maria Jose was talking about an anthology of non-rhyming poetries that will be published by Ecaré. Ecaré is a Venezuelan publishing house that was born 42 years ago. And when they were born, they already had a poetry collection in their catalog. Now their headquarters are in Spain, and they keep publishing Latin American authors, also rhyming Latin American authors, but mixing with Spanish illustrators. One book that is particularly famous is Chamario by Eduardo Polo, illustrated by Catalan illustrator Arnal Ballester. It was first published in 2004, and it's still being a long-selling title at Ecaré, I think, and this disagrees with what Maria Jose was saying before. But then Maria Jose's work has found a place in Spain, and it's beautiful because she has created a complete universe of references, and her poems move at their own pace while they play with silence in a unique way. Maria Jose, I'm sorry, your poems are not the easiest things in the world, but they are beautiful. And whenever Maria Jose leaves a blank line in a poem, she means that blank line. That blank line is part of text. So her work is fantastic. Nonetheless, another best-selling author in Spain is Mar Venegas, who has completely different style. She began as a poet, writing for adults, but then at night, she found herself reciting poems to her child. And so she became a best-selling children's poet in Spain. And she works with rhymes, but then again, she also experiments new styles. She has books for toddlers, but for instance, at A Buen Paso, she has published Con el ojo de la I, Poemas para ir en tren, which is an experimental book that uses calligrams, coded languages, imaginary languages of her own creation. It's a book that mainly plays with words applying some Dadaist principles. Or she published an ABC book made out of haikus, Abecedario del Cuerpo Imaginado. She took the haiku form, but she used it to talk about the human body, allowing for nature to appear only in the haiga, in the illustrations. So she intentionally broke a haiku rule, but then she got it back in the image. And since we publish picture books, I find that playing this way with words and images is a true pleasure, I think.
Well, I can say we don't have something like this in Russian poetry. Well, interesting that we were talking about the unrhymed verses, about the free verse, because this interesting thing about Louise Gluck, who got the Nobel Prize just yesterday, and people in Russia who, well, she's not translated a lot into Russian. I know her, and some people who are into verses, they know her. But when people on the Facebook began to post her poems, there were a lot of people who wrote that it is unrhymed, it is not poetry, and so on. So we have a very strong tradition in Russia, really strong tradition of the rhyme poetry. But talking about the experiment, I would like to talk a bit more about the experiment, as I am very into the experimental children books, and those which Ariana mentioned are very interesting. Well, for example, I remember the amazing books by Umberto Eco, The Bomb and the General, and two others, which were published with illustrations of Eugenio Carmi. They are considered as very experimental books in Russia. They were published several years ago, and there were lots of articles on that. And well, they are, for Russian readers, really experimental. that's why I'd like to ask Beatrice. I'd like to ask you first because I mentioned Echo, and I would like to ask you about that first. Is there a place? Well, we know it is a place for experiment in the contemporary children's poetry, but should there will be a rhyme and rhythm, or it can be written in free verse? More about that. And are there any? It is more important. Are there any rules of children's poetry, or there are no rules?
I think there are no rules really. It's a little bit like for illustrated books. I mean, a child doesn't expect anything. You can really do whatever you want, propose whatever you want, and that's what you have to work for. I mean, you have such a wide range of possibilities, and a child will never say, I don't want this, because he doesn't really know what he wants. So it's up to us to offer them the best experiences ever, both in illustrated books, in picture books, and in verse, for instance. So there should be no rules really. I'd like to mention a very funny book, which is not really a poetry book, but anyway, it works like that. The author is Manuela Bussolati, and this funny book is called Tarari Tararera. It's all written in an imaginary language, so it's full of tiny little beings that are not animals, not, I mean, they go around, and of course they've got adventures to live, and it's all written in this language that doesn't exist, but it depends on how you as a reader connect with the book and with the kid, of course. So it is always through the adult that this passes. Of course, this works for smaller children, but this kind of relationship that can pass through poetry is very important. I mean, how you read it, it's not necessary to be professionals. I mean, it's just the kind of warmth you put in this form of talking with kids through books. And so in this sense, I think that poetry can be really a precious means of creating links. And yes, there are no rules. Anybody can do anything, as long as it is, I mean, it makes sense. There has to be a strong project behind, even though you shouldn't see the project. You just should see the result and see how it echoes on the listener.
And Maria Jose, do you have any rules, and do you have any personal rules maybe for yourself as a poet? Because as we know from Ariana, it is not easy to translate your poetry.
No,
¿Tienes algunas reglas personales para escribir poemas? Porque no son fáciles de traducir, como decía Ariana antes.
Bueno, a mí me parece que exista, antes de contestarte, exista o no exista rima, sí en la poesía debe existir un ritmo. O sea, la poesía se sostiene en el ritmo. El verso libre creo que se salva menos que la poesía rimada de esa necesidad. Y a partir de ahí, bueno, yo a la hora de escribir imito mucho a los niños, esa mirada que tienen como si fuera la primera vez, ¿no? que ven las cosas, cuando se enfrentan al lenguaje y lo liberan de su función utilitaria. Eso lo hacen los niños cuando comienzan a hablar. Son cosas parecidas lo que hacemos, yo creo, nadamos en aguas similares los niños, sobre todo en ese periodo en que están aprendiendo a hablar, experimentando, en que cuando aún el lenguaje no se ha fijado totalmente, el lenguaje significado es una cosa todavía más plástica. Creo que ese aprender a hablar, ese estirar los sonidos, ese quitar o dar significado a nuestro antojo, saltándonos un poco la rigidez del diccionario, creo que es lo que hacemos tanto los niños como los poetas.
Well, let me start by saying that It seems to me that whether or not there is a rhyme, in poetry there must be a rhythm. Poetry, in fact, is sustained by the rhythm. Free verse, in my opinion, is not spared from that need. On whether or not there is a space for experimentation, I think that it's in that space of experimentation, of freedom, that poetry can meet with children, because it's a space that they share. In my writing, for instance, I try to imitate children, you know, the way they look at the world as if it were the first time they see it, when they're in that very period when they're discovering language and they're learning how to speak. Everything seems new, and the language still has that special plasticity that tends to be lost with time, because poetry releases language from its utilitarian functions and from the utilitarian gaze. For the child who has not yet fully entered into, you know, the social dynamics, poetry resonates especially because children and poets swim in similar waters, learning how to speak and to stretch out sounds, to withdraw or to give meanings at our own whim, bypassing the rigidness of the dictionary.
I really like that statement, discovering language, because a poet is always been discovering language. Well, Ariana, what about breaking rules?
Well, I have the perfect example. It so happens because Beatrice has talked about the relationship between poetry and illustration, and Maria Jose about the importance of rhythm in poetry. And a thing that has a lot of rhythm is rain. And I have to show this to you. This is a poetry.
I know this book. Yeah, I know this book. Yeah, I know this book.
Isn't it amazing?
It's amazing. Yeah, because I've been to the Hans Christian Andersen jury and I've seen that.
Okay, it's Ur, El Libro de Lluvia. It's written by Juan Cruz Higueravide and illustrated by Elena Odriozola. It's a book that's not a book. It is a box that contains a booklet with the text and a CD. So you can listen to the poems while you are playing with the images. And the images are loose sheets of, well, now that I have it here, I have to show it to you. Some are sheets of paper and some are acetate. And so you reproduce the rhythm of the rain, combining acetate, images, and creating your own sequence. And that's fantastic. So the reader can listen to the text read aloud, compose the images, and the reading experience becomes a form of playing in a most clever and sensible way. And just like you all were saying, poetry is a way of playing with the language. And this playful element is essential in children's poetry. But I dare say that it's also essential in general in children's literature. In fact, many successful picture books written basically in prose and telling a straightforward story many times contain elements that come out of poetry. Sometimes they contain rhymes, they contain a peculiar rhythm, they contain onomatopoeias, and so on. I think this happens quite a lot in children's literature.
You know, you just showed this book, and I remembered the only trip that I had succeeded to make this year. It was to Munich when we worked with the Hans Christian Andersen Award jury at the Munich Library. And I've spent an evening with those books with illustrations of Odriozola, because they're amazing. Playing and listening to those verses, it's just amazing one. Well, one more question for everybody about the age of a child to which the poetry is addressed to. Well, everybody thinks that the poetry for the very small ones has to be as simple as possible in the terms of form, style, experiments, and everything that we talk, and the themes and everything. So it's too simple and it should be very simple. But is it really so? Is that children's poetry for the smaller ones is so simple as it seems? Maybe poetry for the small ones can be more complicated than for adults even. Well, let's start with Beatrice. What do you think about that?
It should be, it has to be daring anyway. I mean, as an author, I mean, I don't write poetry. I write poetry, but I don't publish it, so that I'm a little bit apart from that. But I think it's really a continuous dare to yourself, first of all. But it's not so important. I mean, I think when one writes, he doesn't really think about an age group. I mean, of course, there are general and user categories, but it's not so strict. You just write because it comes out, because it takes a certain form. And I think it's not really important to choose to be simple, to be plain, because I mean, I remember as a kid, I spent so much time mulling over the meaning of words I didn't know, but I liked a lot because of the sound they made. It's as simple as that. So I don't think a kid really stops or has a problem in understanding or not understanding what is meant really by a poem. The rhythm is much more important. This way of being caught up and driven away and washed away somehow.
So it's much more complicated than we think, yes? The poetry for the small ones.
Yes, at the end, yes, it is. Yes, it is. But I think it's not I mean, it's not a matter of deciding you have to be simple or complicated. I think it just comes out. I mean, it needs a lot of work, of course, but it just comes out that way. So I would say that thing that we call inspiration somehow is very important, and it's something we cannot really measure. So it just is like it is, and that's the charm, and that's the mystery of that also.
Yeah, Maria Jose, what do you think about the poetry for the smaller ones? Should it be simple or it can be very complicated?
Yo creo
La poesía
que en
para los
este
más
espacio,
pequeños puede ser sencilla o hay que complicarla mucho.
Bueno, yo creo que la poesía infantil funciona como otros géneros infantiles, o sea, se parece tiene un funcionamiento similar a lo que pasa con otros géneros. Están las grandes preguntas, la necesidad de amor, el miedo a la muerte, no son exclusivas de una edad. La literatura lo que hace a cualquier edad, yo creo, es acompañarnos en esas preguntas. Pero cuando somos niños muy pequeños, debe hacerlo con palabras que estén a nuestro alcance. Las palabras abstractas, por ejemplo, creo que no funcionan con niños muy pequeños. Pero eso no significa que los niños muy pequeños no sientan en su vida la presencia de lo innombrable y de todas estas grandes preguntas de las que sí se hace cargo la poesía. Entonces ahí está el desafío de encontrar esas palabras al alcance de los niños sin bajar lo que quieren nombrar, ¿sí? Sin claudicar en lo que la poesía a cualquier edad quiere nombrar, creo.
I think that in this space, children's poetry works exactly like other children's genres. I mean, the big questions, the need for love, the fear of death, are not limited to one age only. What literature actually does at any age is to accompany us in those questions. But with children, it must do so with words that are within their reach. In fact, abstract words will not work with very small children, but that doesn't mean that very small children don't feel the presence of the unmentionable in their lives. I mean, the big questions that are in fact addressed by poetry. So I think the big challenge here is finding the right words that are within the reach of very small children without diminishing in any way the very meaning that they're trying to express.
So like touching some, using some words to not to talk about or just to have some hints. Yeah, I would say dropping hints. So giving some, well, some information for them to understand more inside of the poem. Yes.
Lo que entiendes es darles alguna información para que puedan de su manera expresar lo que sienten y encontrar las palabras.
Sí, creo que sobre todo no caer en la tentación de no dejarles, porque son pequeños, un espacio vacío para que ellos encuentren según su historia, según su sensibilidad, según su necesidad, lo que necesiten encontrar en el poema. Creo que los poemas para niños muy pequeños tendemos a llenarlos demasiado. Y la poesía muy llena creo que no deja de cumplir esta función que tiene de estar entre lo que se nombra y no.
What I think that is that we shouldn't fall into the temptation of not leaving enough space for small children to find their own stories, their own sensitivities, their own needs within that poem. And we shouldn't fill it too much. We tend to fill them up so much that they cannot find what they're looking for. And in fact, we have to find a way to let them find what they're looking for.
Yeah, so this is the discovering not only language, but the meaning of the language. Yeah, it's interesting, really. And what about you, Ariana? What do you think about the poetry for the smaller ones?
Yeah, maybe I can talk about a more technical part, and in following the way of what's normally published in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
But saying that poems from toddlers, but poems coming from the popular folklore, they already contain metaphors. They express themselves to metaphor. We have the song of the Cinco Lobitos, the 5 little wolves, and the 5 little wolves are the finger. So at the same time as you are reciting the poem, or the mother or the father is chanting, is singing the poem with the child, you are also encouraging the child to get to know her own body and gain conscience of it. And it's a simple metaphor, but it is a metaphor, and it is an alive image. And then that's on the side of the metaphor, and the other side of playing with the language and doing things with words, because of course you needed to understand words, but those words that have a sound, a magical sound, you don't understand them, but children like to repeat them, it's as if they were tasting these words. How can I say it? Let me tell you about a book published by Abu Paso. Children love this book. I do, but children love it more than I do. It never fails to catch the eye at every book fair. Malakatu. It's an invented word. And it's a picture book that plays with the spread, with the page, with the images, and with the words, to tell the story of a big argument between a mother and her child. It's time to brush the teeth, but the child has a different plan. He wants to play. So a fight begins, and it brings out sorceries that transform the mother and child into imaginary creature. And the text is all about the sorceries. The text doesn't tell the story. These sorceries are beautiful tongue twisters. If you read the whole book, each page works like a verse in a longer poem. At first, you feel you don't understand anything, because since the words work magic, they are magic, they sound weird. one strophe. Plasta, plastable, stipilitable, reina de frotar, de nunca acabar. Que si frota, refrota, sipilifrota, la espuma me empieza a brotar. Estoy frito, refrito, sipilifrito. Harto, no puedo más. Plasta de dientes, plasta de dientes, fi, fa, fu, maracatú. But then on the page, the mother has been transformed into a toothpaste. I can tell you some sort of English translation so you can understand. What a pain this rush to wash. You're the queen of the brushing brush. Got a brush and scrape and scrub, foam and bubbles bubbling out. That's it. I'm out. You're a toothpaste, 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 toothpaste. Fifa, fu, malakadu, boom. And she is transformed. So it's pure pleasure of playing and of saying things, because as you read the book, then you find out, oh, she's talking of this tale, she's talking of this thing, she's talking of that other thing, but mainly she is playing with words and, well, with mother and child and son relationship, which is.
You know, it's, well, firstly, it sounds amazing in Spanish. Phonetically, it's some masterpiece, I would say, and you read it amazingly. But, you know, it sounds a bit like there was a Dadaist poet, Hugo Ball, who used some of those experiments in 1910s, I would say. He wasn't children poet, he was an avant-garde German poet, but he wrote something like this in very funny costume, I would say. Well, it's interesting, it's very interesting, and I would say that there's another layer of the information, the phonetic layer of the information, which is very important for the children's poetry. I agree. Yeah. So you mentioned folklore, and I have some more questions on the folklore because it's very interesting. We all are from different cultures and from different traditions, and the traditions are pretty strong in the literature, and the children's literature, it's very strong. And Spanish and Italian children's poetries and poetry from Chile have huge traditions, and how the contemporary poetry work with this tradition. I mean, the folklore motives, maybe folklore creatures, maybe some quotations from authors, or maybe quotations from the folklore. Can you please give some examples, some very interesting examples of using the folklore forms? Well, let's start with María José.
Bueno, creo que cada poeta tiene sus poetas mayores, ¿no? Creo que es imposible escribir sin ellos. Sí me parece que en el caso de la poesía infantil latinoamericana que se produce hoy, esa influencia no es tan fácil de identificar o de seguir. Por ejemplo, pienso en el caso de un poeta argentino que a mí me encanta, que se llama Juan Lima, que es muy experimental y hace, bueno, poemas con sonidos, hace unas esculturas de frutas muy divertidas que combina con los poemas. Yo identifico las citas que él hace a Nicanor Parra, por ejemplo. Pero no sé si sea tan claro para alguien que no sea lector también de Nicanor Parra. Donde sí puede haber una influencia más clara, creo que es en las décimas que acá se siguen escribiendo y se siguen publicando, pero en las que nosotros desde acá, más que identificar a Calderón de la Barca, sí nos encontramos con el ritmo de Violeta Parra, que fue una de las grandes artistas que construyó su voz a partir del encuentro con el mundo campesino. Creo que hay una deuda muy grande con ese mundo, que creo que nuestro paisaje y sobre todo el habla, el ritmo particular de los cantores y de los poetas campesinos no está en nuestra poesía para niños. La mirada, la voz de los pueblos indígenas que tanto podrían, creo yo, decirnos, está en algunos libros, pero no en la literatura para niños que uno encuentra fácilmente en una librería. Entonces creo que ahí hay una deuda y que si la comenzamos, creo que a saldar desde el mundo editorial, desde los espacios de reflexión, desde la escuela, los más beneficiados van a ser los niños de nuestra escuela, porque todos los latinoamericanos tenemos de manera más o menos visible esa raíz, y para nosotros sería importante encontrarla en los libros, encontrarla en esos poemas que leemos.
I think that every poet have their greatest reference poets. One cannot possibly write without them. It does seem to me that in the case of current Latin American children's poetry, that influence is not so easy to identify or to follow. For example, there's a very, there's an Argentinian author that I particularly love, Juan Lima, and I really like, he's very experimental, and his fruit sculptures are particularly well known. And in this, in his work, I tend to easily identify quotations of Nicanor Parra's poetry, and probably people that don't know Nicanor Parra's will not find the same kind of quotations, but I feel them very, very clear. Where there could be a clearer influence instead is in the decimas, the 10-line poems, which continue to be written and published, and where we, rather than identifying Calderón de la Barca, we find the rhythm of Violeta Parra, one of the great artists who built her voice through her encounters with the peasant world. I think we owe an amazing debt to that world. I think that our landscapes, and above all our speech, the particular rhythm of the peasant singers and poets is not present in our poetry for children. The look and the voice of the indigenous peoples who could tell us so much are to be found in some books, but not in the children's literature that one can easily find in bookshops. And here there is a very major debt on our part yet to be paid. And if we start to pay it off, and I'm talking about the publishing world, these spaces of reflection from the schools, I think the children will be the ones who will benefit the most. All Latin Americans have this very same root in the peasant world in a more or less visible way. And for us, it would be very important to find it in books and to find it in the poems we read.
Yeah, it is interesting because, for example, in Russian poetry, we do have some major figures, as I mentioned, for example, Marshak and Tchaikovsky, who are very important for the contemporary children poets, and they use their tradition and quote them a lot, and we quote the folklore motifs a lot too, so it's really very popular. And Beatrice, what about contemporary children's poetry in Italy? Does it have a connection with folklore or with other authors, especially, of course, Gianni Rodari and many other poets as well?
I would say there can be some connection, and you can recognize it in the short verse and in the key use of the rhyme in some of the I would say funniest and also easiest kind of poems for kids. It doesn't mean they are not interesting. I mean, they just play with that kind of tradition and they reuse that somehow, especially picking up from the kind of verses that kids invent in games and tend to repeat or reinvent or just to modify. I mean, it's in jumps of generations, you recognize the same kind of little rhyme, but a little bit changed because sometimes it's just the matter of one word or something from the contemporary word that gets into that. I remember a very nice, beautiful novel by Alison Lurie, who is also a scholar of children's literature. It's called Foreign Affairs. I don't know whether you have read it. It's about an academic, a woman who flies from the US to the UK because she's also a children's writer, but she's also studying nursery rhymes. And she goes in the streets listening to kids repeating that kind of rhymes, which are somehow very very gritty, because they are, I mean, they are colored by everyday life, and she's astonished because she's an academic. She would like to find this kind of ancient perfection in rhymes, and then she finds them contaminated by reality. So sometimes it happens like that, and I think it's interesting to see the links. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And are there any folklore heroes who are very popular in the contemporary Italian children's poetry?
No, I would say
No?
they are not that there anymore. I mean, you know, the fiabe italiane, that kind of thing, which were rewritten by Italo Calvino, miscellaneous collection from all over Italy, from the south to the north, east, west, but traditions were very different. So there is somehow this corpus represents very well what Italian folklore was, but I mean, it's more of a, I mean, a kind of passion you grow up with when you are older, an adult somehow. So you don't pick up that kind of stories for kids now. So it's more literary somehow.
Ariana, and what about tradition in Spain?
Well, there's a lot of tradition, I think, because many investigators and then writers, illustrators, and poets have gone back to the oral tradition and to the folklore. It is really so present in the board books made for toddlers. And for instance, in Malakatu, the book I was talking before, it may look a Dadaist poem, but it really comes from old Spanish rhymes. There's a lot of tradition of nursery rhymes, lullabies, tongue twisters. And for instance, I don't know if you can recall, plasta, plastable, sipilitable, reina del frotar de nunca acabar. Okay, a popular rhyme text is madre notable sipilitable, voy al campo, blanco, tranco, sipilitranco, por una liebre, tiebre, no tiebre, sipilitriebre. So you can see that the connection between the modern text and this popular text is really strong. And I see that especially in the poems written for younger children, there's this attention to the oral tradition. Then, as you grow up, just like Maria Jose was saying, las décimas, there are some forms, styles of poetry that poets use willingly. And then, well, in Spain, there's Gloria Fuertes. She is a children's favorite, but she was also a very good adult poet. And those, Federico Garcia Lorca, Machado, they are always there. In the mind of anyone who's writing, they are there.
Of course, they're always in my mind when I'm thinking about the Spanish poetry. We were talking about the poetry for the smaller ones, and now I have a very difficult question about the term of young adult poetry. Well, young adult is teenagers who already are not who are not teenagers, but yet not adults. Well, is there young adult poetry in children's poetry book market? How would you define the poetry for young adults, as we all understand that the the difference between the adult poetry and young adult poetry is, well, quite very, very difficult to define those. Beatrice, how would you define the young adult poetry, contemporary young adult poetry in Italy?
I would like not to define it, because I think that young adult is already a quite a weird definition. I mean, they don't like to be defined like that. They don't like to be somehow settled into an age group. No, of course, literary for young adults exists, but it's mostly, I mean, a reverse thing. Sometimes a novel is picked up very widely all over the world, but that kind of target, and it becomes a young adult novel. There are very few authors in YA literature who chose that path. For instance, John Green or Aidan Chambers, they really chose. The other ones just found themselves into that somehow, and it's in a little bit of a casual way. As for poetry, there are some examples in the US that have been translated into Italian with, I mean, they are interesting, but they didn't catch so much. I think YA are more interested, for instance, in the poems of Rupi Kaur, who is a poet and has this kind of widespread audience. Otherwise, I mean, I would not recommend somehow to sit down and try and write for that kind of age group, because it's really, I mean, it's not easy to do this with a clear mind and a clear conscience also. I mean, we published a collection of Chiara Carminati's poems for teenagers somehow, but I mean, she's a poet, an all-round poet, so she could afford to do this. But I wouldn't recommend, I wouldn't look at that kind of regrouping poetry under that definition.
And Ariana, what do you think about the young adult poetry?
Well. In Spain, somehow young adult poetry has experienced a huge success lately through some pretty awful books that pretend to convey wise thoughts or ideas, but in fact are shallow self-help platitudes, written without paying attention to words or writing techniques, but they are huge. And the authors have become famous on YouTube or Twitter, and the books are instant bestsellers. And since we adults believe that we are younger than we are, they have a really big audience, and you can buy them at book fairs if you can stand lining up for hours. I'm thinking of an endless queue at the Madrid Book Fair in 2019. And needless to say, you can always find this kind of books in airport bookstores. There's a lot, and it's this somehow inspiring poetry, but that in fact is not poetry, and it's simply shallow. And it's scary because they're starting to win also poetry contests for adults. On the other side, I think that working on poetry at school or later with young adults is still an amazing thing. And I was thinking that there's a really good Spanish poet, Raúl Vacas Polo, and he's doing a great job writing and teaching poetry. And his workshops, well, teenagers, can find new ways to express themselves. And these ways make them feel smart and creative. Because when you're able to come up with a clever calembour, or to imitate a specific communication style, like a classified ad, for instance, or to play with some language code, you feel you're the best. And I think that that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what about Chile, María José? What do you say?
Yo nunca he entendido, o sea, he terminado de entender muy bien la categoría juvenil. Tal vez hay algo que a mí se me escapa. Los 20 poemas de amor, por ejemplo, de Pablo Neruda, por citar un ejemplo que todos conocemos bien, son poemas juveniles. Creo que más bien son como lo suficientemente universales para interesar a cualquier joven que está enamorado. La poesía intensa, por ejemplo, de Alejandra Pizarnik. Creo que puede resonar perfectamente los lectores que a esa edad también que es también la más intensa de las edades. Entonces, tal vez la juventud justamente sea el momento en el que sentimos que las palabras no nos alcanzan para todo eso que nos pasa y que queremos expresar, y por lo mismo es la edad en la que necesitamos, no sé si poesía para jóvenes, pero sí la mejor poesía. Entonces, no creo, la verdad, mucho en la existencia de esa categoría. No, puede ser que yo no la entienda, pero creo que es más bien categorías funcionales para ordenar los catálogos, algo así, pero no la veo con tanta claridad.
Well, I have to say that I've never really fully understood the young adult category. Maybe I'm missing something. For instance, the 20 love poems by Pablo Neruda, just to quote an example that everybody knows, are they poems suitable for young adults? I think they are universal enough to be of interest even to a young person in love. The intense poetry of, just to mention an example, Alejandra Pizarnik, I think can perfectly resonate with readers of that age, which is also the most intense of ages. Perhaps youth is the time when we mostly feel that words are not enough to describe all that happens to us and that we want to express, and therefore it's the age when we need the best of poetry. So I don't believe much in the existence of that category. Maybe I don't understand enough. Maybe it's just functional to the market, or just to fill up catalogs. But I have to say that I don't see it very clearly.
Yeah, I don't see it very clearly as well, if you ask me, because it's very hard to define the young adult poetry, really hard. But I would recommend the lyrical poems by Pablo Neruda to the young adult readers. But I'm thinking about Alexandra Pizarnik, because Alejandra Pizarnik is, well, she is complicated. She is very good, but maybe Gabriela Mistral, in a way, she can be read by young adult, well, as well. And there's one more question, which is very difficult as well. It is a translation of poetry. Well, there was a famous Russian poet, Fyodor Tuchev. He once said that to read poetry in translation is the same as to kiss someone through a veil. This is the very beautiful image, but what do you think? Is it possible to translate poetry? Should the poetry translator try to construct the original rhythm, rhymes, and everything, or it can be just a free verse? And should a translator be a poet or not? Ariana, what do you think about that?
Well, definitely, the translator needs to be a poet. And he or she will have to decide what's the most important element in the poems they are translating. Is it the rhythm, or is it instead some clever wordplay, and try to work on that? In this case, a translator truly works as a poet and as a writer. Then again, we did something pretty peculiar with Maria Jose. We published one of her books that had illustrations by a Japanese artist, Toyoiko Kokumai, and we published it in a bilingual edition in Spanish and in Japanese, because Maria Jose and I think that was the idea, were enjoying the beauty, and it's a really peculiar book, of this book, but we thought, hey, the author of the illustrations can't enjoy the book because he has simply read a rough translation in English. So we published it in 2 languages. I think when you're publishing peculiar books, you can do some sort of things. On the other hand, sometimes I also believe, I often wonder if we shouldn't take advantage of the fact that our societies tend to be composed by people who come from different countries and cultures. Wouldn't it be lovely at school to be able to hear someone reading poems in their own language, a language we do not understand at all, but whose melody might captivate us? Wouldn't that be a beautiful experience? Then we could decide if we would like to learn about the meaning of the poem as well, or if we prefer to keep the mystery. Keeping the mystery is beautiful as well.
Yeah, sounds great. And Beatrice, what do you think about the translation of the poetry?
I think one has to be very well versed in words. I mean, so yes, nearly a poet. But I think it depends on, I mean, from time to time you have to choose the meaning or the music. So it depends really. Every single poet is telling you something different. Once I translated from English a very beautiful collection edited by Fiona Waters, Glitter When You Jump, and it's a collection of poems that crosses time, because the first one, some are Elizabethan and then up and up and up to our times. So every kind of style of meter and so on. And it was a huge challenge, but such a, I mean, such an adventure, because every time you have just to start from scratch, forget the last poem and start really from the beginning. And I think that's the beauty of this job, also being always challenged by yourself and by words, by the author, but by his word, because you have to understand also this. So that's great.
And Maria Jose, what do you think about the poetry translation?
Bueno, creo que a los escritores y a los lectores no nos queda otra opción que confiar en que sí es posible la traducción de poesía. Creo que hoy la tecnología facilita las cosas, nos permite estar comunicados, hacernos preguntas por correo entre el traductor y el autor, llegar como en conjunto a las palabras y a los ritmos que se pueden escapar en la lectura en el papel. No sé si un traductor de poesía tiene que ser poeta, pero sí creo que debe tener una sensibilidad especial al ritmo, a la respiración del autor, tenga o no tenga rima, o sea, o no para niños. Creo que la poesía es inseparable de esa experiencia rítmica. Entonces, sí creo que el traductor necesita acercarse al ritmo, tener un oído sensible.
Well, I think that we writers and readers have no choice but to trust that, yes, it is possible to translate poetry. But today, technology helps us making things easier, allows us to stay connected, to ask questions by mail, and to reach out together to the words and rhythms that we may miss when we are reading poems on paper. I don't know if a translator of poetry should be a poet, but I do believe that he or she should have a special sensitivity for the rhythm and the breathing of the author, because whether it has a rhyme or not, whether it is for children or not, poetry is sustained is sustained by and inseparable from the rhythmic experience. So I do think the translator needs to get as close as possible to the rhythm, to have a very sensitive ear.
I remembered a very interesting story about the famous Russian translator Grigory Khrushchev, who is very famous for his translations of English language poetry for children, and he's a poet for children as well. And once he was translating an ABC by Edward Lear, and there are 26 verses, about 26 letters of the Latin ABC, but in Russia we have 32 letters, and it was a very big problem because he didn't have enough poems by Edward Lear to translate, so he had to make up some more poems in the style of Edward Lear to stick to the Russian ABC, because Russian children had to read it and they would see the lost letters. So yeah, it's very interesting in terms of the translator and the poet in one person. And well, we're concluding and we don't have enough time for the discussion, which is really very interesting. I wanted to ask you one more last question. What books of the contemporary poetry of your country, or maybe of the other countries' poetry, would you recommend to read and translate all over the world right now? Well, Beatrice, let's start with you.
I won't mention Italians so that I don't offend anybody. There are so many good authors. But I would recommend Love That Dog by Sharon Creech, which is also an experience in trying to make poetry by themselves. And then Michael Rosen and Shel Silverstein. So these are my three choices.
Ariana, what would you recommend?
Maria Jose Ferrada. I'm sorry, I'm deeply in love with her work. I think she is the best in the world. But then, okay, I would recommend, and this was not prepared, Beatrice. I'm totally ignorant. I discovered it this morning. I didn't know you were the publishing editor, but this summer I fell in love with this book. I already liked Silvia Vecchini's work. Well, in fact, Maria Jose has been translated into Italian. Topi Pittori has published El lenguaje de las cosas. I'm just thinking about it because Silvia Vecchini also publishes at Topi Pittori. This book is prima che sia notte. Everyone should read it. It's a novel. Oh, talking about experimentation. It's a novel told through poems. It is such a beautiful book because even if it tells a sad story, when you finish it, you feel almost happy. You come out with a renewed love of life, with all its difficulties and problems, but you love it. This book gives hope to me, represents an important reminder that life is more complete when we learn to love and to take care of others. It is a very important and relevant message because social networks or our hunger for likes poison our souls and our minds. And this book, through the most beautiful words, tell us that we can choose and that another world is possible. And that's too much.
Thank you, Ariana. And Maria Jose, what do you think? What would you recommend?
Yo voy a recomendar un libro que mencioné antes, que se llama Cajita de Fósforos, que es una antología que hizo el mexicano Adolfo Córdoba, que va a publicar ECARE el año 2021, porque creo que da un panorama de esa poesía que cree en la libertad y en un lector que, independiente de su edad, es capaz de relacionarse con la lectura, no solo desde el entender lo que lee, sino que es capaz de vivir a partir de esta lectura una experiencia estética, una experiencia que en el caso de la poesía yo creo que se relaciona con, como hemos estado hablando, con la libertad. Así que esa es mi recomendación.
I would like to recommend Cajita de Fósforos, in English Matchbox, by the Mexican poet Adolfo Córdoba, that will be published by ECARE in 2021. And I mentioned him before because he's the author of this anthology. My suggestion is this book because I think it gives an overview of what kind of poetry, of that kind of poetry that believes in freedom and in readers that independently of their age are able to relate to their reading, not only by understanding what they read, but readers that are really able to live their reading as an aesthetic experience, as an experience that in the case of poetry, for instance, is very closely linked to freedom.
Well, thank you so much for this for this discussion. It was really interesting. I'd like to have one more and more discussions, but we don't have enough time. It was very great to visit the Children's Garden of Verse and to be there with all of you. It was great to know more about the children's poetry of Italy, Spain, and Chile. It's really interesting for me personally because I'm very interested in this sphere, especially. Thank you so much for participating in this event, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.